Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Future of Work show. I'm super excited because this time we're doing a new format. We have a limited series on diversity and inclusion, and today is episode one of this limited series. For more details, do take a look at the poster we put up just today. But just giving you a little bit of a glimpse into what's going to come up ahead. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Richa Bansal, the founder of Sarathee, and we're going to take a look at what's a starter kit for organizations which are just considering the idea of hiring people who are differently abled or people with disabilities. And then we're going to take a look at what does it mean to hire people who are visually impaired. We will speak to people who are personally working in this field, both people who have disabilities and those who are helping organizations hire them, to take a look at what are some of the specifics that we need to be more conscious of. We will then take a look at what does it mean to hire people who are neurodivergent, and what does it mean to build technology organizations in particular with people on the autism spectrum. And finally, we have a personal and policy level conversation with a gentleman called Arman Ali, and we're going to take a look at what the movement around hiring people with disabilities is within India. So, with that said, let me get on Richa Bansal. Hi, Richa.
Hi.
So good to have you on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
So, for those of you who are just joining in, let me tell you that Richa is really the whole reason why we're doing this limited series. So, I've known Richa for a while, I think 4 or 5 years, and she's
Yeah.
absolutely passionate and excited about the work that she does. I've been super impressed by the work Sarathee's been doing, and we've been speaking about how can we spread the word around what does it really mean for organizations to hire people with disabilities. And that's how we came up with the idea of this limited series. So there's a special thank you to you, Richa. Thank you so much.
I'm so glad that you actually thought this was something that was important to cover as a part of the series. Thank you so much.
No, 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 not at all. So your organization, Richa Sarathee, is just doing some amazing work. And, today's episode is really a starter kit for organizations that are considering hiring people with disabilities and yet perhaps have no clue how to. And interestingly, your website also speaks about that. It speaks about, you know, just to quote what you yourself say, that some 55% of organizations have expressed an interest in working with people with disabilities, yet very few really know what that means. So maybe you can help us get started by explaining what in India counts as a disability.
Well, as we were just discussing, I think because when it comes to disability, it is such an ignored space that people have their own comprehension, own understanding of what it means. So in 2016, there was a special RPWD Act which was released and which actually specifies the 21 disabilities that are recognized by the government of India as persons with disabilities. Now, what essentially it means is, in a very normal way, if we were to comprehend, people who have sensory deficit, people who have locomotor or orthopedic challenges, people who have intellectual and mental illnesses. Now, eventually, any such disability which is permanent in nature, it's long term permanent in nature, and it does not or prohibits you from engaging with the society in the way that you and I do, is a disability. And when we talk about disabilities, as per the government, anybody who has more than 40% recognized disability is considered a person with disability. So that's what disability is. And unfortunately, the way most people recognize disability is the way we see disability. So a person who's on a wheelchair, a person who's using a stick, those are people who are mostly recognized as persons with disabilities otherwise.
I saw also on your website the statistic that 70% of employable people with disabilities are actually unemployed. Can you
Yeah.
speak to this a little?
Well, the fact is that we do not know enough about these people, and that's the reason why we sit at a level of presumption that people with disabilities are not educated, people with disabilities are not skilled, and therefore they are not capable of working in a regular corporate ecosystem. But the reality is that there are enough and more persons with disabilities who are educated, skilled, and unfortunately are only marginally employed. There is still such a huge population of persons with disabilities who are not able to find mainstream jobs, and that's the reason why there is such a huge number that is quoted as persons with disabilities who are not employed at all.
Is there a business case you think, Richa, for hiring people with disabilities?
Of course, of course. So, in fact, Charlie, whether it is Sarathi or me in my personal capacity, I think we are a strong advocate for the business case of disability inclusion. And let me take you back to how Sarathi actually started. When we started Sarathi in 2018, the whole premise of starting Sarathi as a for profit organization was the fact that we wanted to establish a business case for inclusion. That's why when we started, we were a team of about 5 people, of which 4 people were people with vision impairment, and one person was a person with orthopedic challenge. And over the course of first 1.5 year, the only intention we had was to work as a BPO, as a service provider to large organizations, such that we could actually deliver business case of inclusion. And today, I think after 6 years, we are so proud of the fact that we are recognized at par and sometimes even more when it comes to the kind of value that we are in a position to deliver when it comes to various organizations that we support. So there is definitely a very strong business case for disability inclusion. Now, while I talk about Sarathi here, but I think if you just look at the whole situation, 15% of the global population are persons with disability. Now, if you come to think of it, do you want to ignore them as a customer? Do we want to ignore them as a potential employee in an organization? Today, most organizations are talking about building a diverse culture, because diversity also brings in culture transformation, it brings in new ideas, it brings in the amount of empathy that we are actually looking to build in an organization. So there is no reason why there should be an exclusion for persons with disabilities, right? And that's this very solid business case that exists for them.
Yeah, yeah, and I saw that you spoke somewhere, and of course it's also there on your website. The whole data around differences in attrition rates and
Oh,
productivity. Do you want to speak a little bit to that? Because I think
sure.
many of us aren't aware of some of that.
So when I spoke about Sarathi, we started out as a BPO. We were aware of the fact that we were hiring persons with disabilities. Somewhere we knew the fact that hiring a person with disability would mean that there will be lower attrition. Now, that was in theory that we knew. But in all honesty, it was only when we started working and hiring consciously only persons with disabilities, we realized that we were operating at less than 9% attrition level for a BPO industry, which was not heard of.
Correct.
Regularly, if you were to look it up, I think in India the BPO attrition level sits at about 35%. Now,
Wow.
operating at a 9% essentially meant we were saving out on cost of hiring, on cost of training. And if I just talk about our numbers, I think we were looking at a 23% saving on that cost alone. So clearly, it is driving cost efficiencies and not, ignoring the fact that this is also a space where we have seen a huge amount of commitment. There is a lot of commitment, innovation, and constant need to grow, which also keeps the organization as well as these people going for what they're doing.
So nice to hear that. I'll tell you, Richa, I have heard many organizations whom I've worked with in different capacities speak about how they would like to start this journey.
Yeah.
And in today's conversation, actually, I want you to address organizations which have an intention but really don't know what step one should be.
Yeah.
So now that you've worked in this field for several years, can you talk me through what would be step one for an organization which is considering hiring people with disabilities?
So Shalini, I think, as I would always say, that we've already done the homework because we've gone through that journey ourselves. Uh, so I think sitting at an intent to include is a great place to sit at, because at least there is a conscious leadership intent that exists in an organization. And we have spoken with multiple organizations where we have realized that the challenge is that there is a fear. You don't want to make a mistake, right? You want to be absolutely sure of what you're doing, and rightly so. But sometimes, because of that fear, you're not able to take the first step. And why is that fear? The fear is because there is lack of awareness, there is lack of understanding, right? So I think the very first step that I always tell organizations to take is understand the space, drive that level of awareness which is required before you start to think of operationalizing it. That is the first step. And the next step is to identify the gaps that exist in your organization. Because as much as we want the person whom we want to employ to be ready to get hired, so there is a certain level of employment readiness that you are expecting the person to come
Yeah.
with. The similar way, the organization also has to be ready to include persons with disabilities. And it is therefore important to first identify what the gaps look like. And when it comes to these gaps, a lot of organizations feel that perhaps if we were to just fix the basic accessibility of the physical infrastructure, that is perhaps a good start. Nobody is taking that away. Yes, a good start. However, there are just so many other areas of gaps that exist in an organization. For example, when it comes to people with vision impairment, physical infrastructure is not as important for them as the digital infrastructure accessibility is. So, when we are doing the gap assessment, you need to assess the gaps on physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, social infrastructure. How is your organization feeling about it? What is the employee sentiment looking like? Then only will you know how you are going to bridge that gap and what kind of work you need to do with the employees. Because at the end of the day, you're also talking about culture transformation when you're
Yeah.
going to focus on this, right? So,
Yeah.
so those are important things. Policies. I think there is a mandate for organizations to comply with the equal opportunity policy. But within that equal opportunity policy, the scope of that policy is
Yeah.
something that is hugely dependent on what stage of maturity you are sitting at. What all would you want to include there? Within the policies that already exist in your organization, where is it that you need to build those accommodations so that hiring of persons with disabilities becomes easy for you? They become a seamless part of your ecosystem. Yeah,
So, Rich, if I understand what you're saying correctly, you're saying that first every organization needs to do, some kind of an awareness and audit combination. Is
that's
that
right.
right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. And I'm going to pick up something you said a little while ago that, um, it's a little daunting, this whole task, because as you said, people don't want to make
Yeah.
mistakes. So, do you suggest that organizations start with pilots, or do you think,
Yeah.
there's
So,
another
absolutely,
way?
Bharat. I think most organizations should actually, if they have not ventured into it, the pilot is the way to do it. And when we say pilots, pilots are not about just jumping into hiring. Hiring, in my mind, is an outcome of everything else that you are going to do in the process, because that is naturally going to take place. The moment you have an inclusive hiring policy, you will naturally start including persons with disabilities. I think what is important, however, is to understand how to function with a person with disability, right? So, for example, when we talk about a pilot, a good way to approach it is incubating a few people. So, for example, in a large organization, maybe a particular function gets identified that this is perhaps where we would like to start the pilot. We are not necessarily ready to hire people directly on our role. Maybe we can hire them on somebody else's role, but they come here in our facility we have someone shadow the entire process of induction for the first few months while we get accustomed and used to the idea of how a
Hmm.
person with disability needs to integrate into the ecosystem. That's a very smart way of going about it. And by the end of it, you will feel slightly more confident as to how to navigate this process further yourself.
So, I mean, I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here. I'm going to assume that any organization which hasn't started on this journey, when you do an audit, you'll find कि अभी तो कुछ भी नहीं है. There's nothing. Nobody knows anything about it. Nobody has a clue what's in the policy. The policy has not actually been written keeping in mind people with disabilities, and the three infrastructures you spoke
Yeah.
about: physical, digital, social. Let's assume none of them are there.
Yeah.
So, which I'm pretty sure is not going to be that uncommon. So, what do you do next? Would you
Actually,
recommend, for instance?
you'll be surprised most of the time when we start talking to organizations, they actually say, "You presume that nothing exists."
Yeah,
So
I will.
actually,
I would expect that because this is such a. It's like people don't know anything much about this. I mean, your own data was what, that I don't know, zero point two eight
yeah,
percent.
only 0.28% of the total employee base across private enterprises are persons with
Yeah,
disabilities,
so that's
right?
so.
So
It's
that's
so low.
abysmal. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
when
So actually, organizations don't know. They are sitting at a ground zero right now.
Correct, correct. So should they, assume ground zero and you do this audit and you find maybe like ramps might be there in some places just because that shift, at least physical infrastructure wise, has happened. I mean, not everywhere, but at least in some places. Um, but assume nothing else is there. Assume social infrastructure is not there. Assume that as a leadership team, nobody really understands anything. So, should the next step be education at a leadership team, or do you think, now here's the other choice, do you think it makes sense to just take like one small function or one part of the organization and say, okay, we're going to like educate 5 people who are going to be working closely
Sally,
with.
you'll be surprised. Actually, there is no one solution fit all here because every organization, from a leadership point of view, has a different way of looking at the problem statement and
Hmm.
equally looking at how they want to go about it. Some organizations want to go full throttle, and some organizations want to pick up that one little function, try it out, and then see how it can be scaled up. Having said that, I would like to say one thing, that it's not about audit. The idea of doing this is not to let the organization know you're sitting at a bad place. The idea of conducting these and for the lack of better word, while we are using the word audit, I would say gap assessment, is to essentially understand what is it that we need to work on in the future. And also, this is not something which is a short term plan that is being built, because any organization that has an intention to drive disability inclusion has to have a long term vision with short term goals that have to be defined, short term milestones that have to be defined, right? So, in the initial phase, even if there is an understanding that nothing exists, right? And that does not go on to say that nothing can be done. Yeah, all of it has to be done together. It is still a baby step because the organization equally has to build a very strong understanding of what they are getting into. And there will always be very few people who will be far more invested than the rest of the organization. And it takes a huge amount of effort to convert the various stakeholders into understanding that there is merit in hiring persons with disabilities. I have come across so many organizations where perhaps the DEI person is extremely invested in this, has spent 2 years convincing everybody in the organization this is the way to do it, has actually visited Sarathee to conduct a huge amount of show and tell conversations with her leadership, but nothing really moved. So you need a huge amount of sponsor support in an organization. You need a huge amount of leadership support in an organization to take this forward. So there will always be baby steps, and it has got a long gestation period.
Thanks, Richa, for that. And I'm going to ask you like some real brass tacks because today's episode is starter kit. So, let's say that an organization decides after these conversations and, has the intention, decides to move ahead. Um, how do they find the roles to start off with? I know that in the pre-interview you spoke about, the role that HR plays. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
So today, I think when it comes to DEI or CSR or the ESG, I think all of it somewhere sits in the HR function.
Yeah, sometimes not very
not
justifiably, I
not
have to say.
justified at all, but this is a reality in most organizations. It is sitting with the HR function, and they are the ones who are constantly trying to push the case of inclusion in an organization. And I firmly believe that when it comes to disability inclusion, it can only happen if there is a strong show and tell story. And therefore, the advocates of disability inclusion should be the first set of people who should hire persons with disabilities. And
Fantastic.
and I think when it comes to HR, I personally feel there is such a huge scope of hiring persons with various kinds of disabilities, whether it is HR operations, it is recruitment, it is support. So many things are possible. So I personally believe that till such time you haven't experienced what inclusion means for you, you cannot advocate it for the rest of the organization. So that's why it should start with the HR. And as
Wow.
you just asked also, that what are the various roles in which
Yeah.
a person with disability can be hired. That is mostly the opening statement of most organizations when they are talking to us. And I always say that there is nothing that a person with disability cannot do. It entirely depends on what are the requirements, role responsibilities. Perhaps there are certain areas, like for example, a person with vision impairment perhaps cannot work in a graphic designing space for obvious reasons, right? But a person with vision impairment can be a coder, a person with vision impairment can be a content writer, can be a project coordinator, can be a program manager, can do so many more things, can be a chartered accountant. So, from that point of view, we just have to understand and map what are the possibilities based on the faculties a person has. And therefore, there is a possibility to do anything and everything when it comes to persons with disabilities.
That's such an interesting perspective, Rich. I also like your idea that, maybe HR should be the first space for people to, because it will develop a deeper understanding of what it means to work with people with disabilities. So here's another very practical question, Richa. Do you think it makes more sense to have people with disabilities broken up into different teams, or do you think a few teams with at least a few people with disabilities? Like, what have you seen works better?
Well, Sarathee is an organization where 90% people are persons with disabilities, so I don't know any other. But what I personally believe is that if in an organization across various functions, if every function has at least a couple of people with disabilities, it is bound to increase the creativity quotient of a particular team. It is bound to increase the empathy in that team. So definitely, I will encourage each and every function to have a couple of persons with disabilities to make sure that there is an even spread and it truly fosters inclusion.
So I'm going to push you a little more. Sorry, that's my job today. Like I've noticed, for instance, let's take another dimension of diversity, women. And you know, when there are two women in a physical space, they just feel a lot more comfortable than if there's just one and you're the only woman. So, let's take a small office or whatever. Uh, is there any such guideline for, people with disabilities?
So, look, very good example. Actually, we always look for our tribe because we
Yeah,
feel
right.
comforted, we feel we belong here. And I think from that point of view, I completely understand what you're saying. However, the counter view to that is, Shalini, that if we have a lot of these people together in a unit, they will not necessarily then open up to the rest of the organization, right? Um,
Yeah.
for example, and you spoke about women, so let me share my story. Like, I was in sales, and at the time that I was in sales, very few women were in sales.
You would have been the only one, I suspect.
At the end of the day, was there any other option but to engage with my male colleagues and then drive the overall, the agenda of the business? What did it lead to? There is always enough and more you can learn from others as well, whether they are your male counterparts or your female counterparts. I really owe a huge amount of my sales learning to my male counterparts there. And I think the whole concept of inclusion in an organization is not to create those little pockets and which will operate in silo. The idea is to truly, it's like uh, creating a squash that you are adding multiple things, and finally what will come out is what the taste of that entire end product is going to be. So it has to be a seamless integration. It cannot be that there are pockets and people are working in their own manner. It can't be like that.
Got it, got it. So I'm understanding the starting point is developing awareness and understanding the gaps. Then finding a group that is, the most committed to this process. Sometimes, very often, it's HR, could be any other team, I guess. Someone who's
Exactly.
really committed to the process to start
Yeah.
with a pilot. Is my understanding correct?
Yes, absolutely correct. And I'll just add one more thing there, Shalini. Um, what also is important is when you're doing a pilot, the objective is not to set things out for failure, because the pilot
Yeah.
is extremely important.
Yeah.
So, what you just said, you have to pick up the function or the team which is extremely committed to make it happen, right?
Hmm.
So, that along with the fact that maybe you don't pick up too complex a role to start off with.
Hmm.
Maybe you pick up those kind of roles where it's easy to manage, easy to navigate, and therefore integrate them in as a part of the ecosystem. And then
Right.
you keep adding the layers of complexity to the roles, to various kinds of disabilities, and so on and so forth.
I love that. I love that. I think pick, just common sense, pick roles and teams where they're most likely to succeed, but
Yes,
just be very conscious about that choice. And I also like something you said a little while ago, that show and tell is what works the best. People
absolutely.
learn when they see it in action, and then they have faith in it. I want to take a few of the comments, Richa. Ankit says, "Ma'am, how can we apply?" So I'm assuming he's asking how can he apply to your organization. Uh,
So you can reach out to us on Sarathee's platform, which is www.sarathee.com. There is a place for you to actually register yourself, and we will get back to you.
all right. And people with disabilities, any kind of disability can apply to
Yes,
SARA? All right.
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Then Papia says, in my experience, even when organizations hire people with disability, there's very little done to create the right and safe working environment and infrastructure for them. What is your thought, Richa?
So, as I was saying a while back, Shalini, I think because organizations and people at large still believe that persons with disabilities mean people on wheelchair, the
Mm,
only accessibility or infrastructure they invest in is ramps. That too are yet to, you can't really be sure of whether they exist at all or not. But that is the only thing that comes to people's mind. And therefore, the accessibility and accommodations that are required for persons with disabilities to thrive at work are mostly not existing.
mm,
I'll give you another example, Shalini. And I was reading this study recently. During the pandemic, a lot of persons with disabilities were mainstreamed into jobs, primarily because it was an accepted norm that people could work from anywhere. Now, if you think about it, persons with disabilities need that accommodation to be able to deliver at work, right? And and I think that is something that is required to be built in as a part of company policy and accommodation policy. Today at Sarathi, more than 80% of our people are working from home and we deliver on all possible job roles flawlessly. So it's a matter of investing in your processes to be able to provide this accommodation to people.
Very well said, Richa. Very well said. Actually, there's so much research which says it shows us time and again that anyone who is different, whether it is women
Yeah.
or um, you know a lot of that research is in the US, racial minorities or people of different ages than the mainstream. Every single one who is different performs much better with a flexible work rate. And in
Absolutely.
fact, attrition rates of people who are different drops significantly because that whole psychological labor, and in this case, the very real problem of the physical
Correct.
space as well. The psychological labor of trying to fit in,
Yeah.
uh, that goes away, and it's something which is almost never spoken about. That anytime you're different, there's that effort that you put in to try and fit in, and that's exhausting. So I don't know if you know this, but there's this economist called Nicholas Bloom, and he just came up with another research study, and he sees what happens with women's attrition. Believe it or not, it halves the
Yeah.
moment there's flexibility. So it's so interesting that you also speak about the impact of flexibility, because I can just see how that would play. Also with the LGBTQ community, by the way.
So in
You know,
fact, Shalini, the fact that you just quoted this research, uh, so this is something that also happens. Now, most persons with vision impairment tend to have some kind of slight deformity in their facial structures. Now, what tends to happen is it is also about the person's confidence sometimes. Now, a lot of online meetings take place. Most people are not comfortable switching on their cameras. There is a huge insistence that corporates tend to have on cameras being switched on. Now,
yeah.
these are minor things, but these are also accommodations that have to be built in when we are including PWDs into the ecosystem. Similarly, you talk about people with bipolar, people who are in the autism spectrum, right? In each of these spaces, we don't even realize the kind of accommodation they simply need to be able to work efficiently. And they are mostly psychological than physical.
Very, very well said. So I'm going to go to another point, Richa, that you spoke about, in our last conversation, which is your concern that very often when people do start hiring people with disabilities, they tend to hire them into marginal roles and not necessarily roles where they're likely to have a thriving career. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I think it again comes from a place of bias. It comes from a place of having those stereotypes attached to the community, that this is what is possible, this is what is not possible. Also, the whole space of, I think till very recently, this was being looked at as a CSR agenda.
Yeah.
Even today, a lot of people hold the DEI and the CSR portfolio together, and I can't understand why. Right? Look, at the end of the day, inclusion is not CSR. Inclusion, till such time it is not being driven with an agenda of driving a business case, it doesn't make sense and it will not be sustainable, right? So, most people, most organizations landed up hiring persons with disabilities in marginal roles where they continue to spend their lifetime. So, if a person was hired, let's say, as a call center executive, for 20 years, he's just serving as that only. A person was hired as as someone who was more like an MIS person, continues to actually work through the lifetime like that only, because the focus on growth is not there. And that is something that I think needs to change now. So I am extremely conscious of that, and I'm a strong advocate of the fact that if there is skill, if there is education, I see no reason why we should not be in a position to offer equal opportunities to persons with disabilities.
I love that. I love that. I think it would make a lot of sense. And I totally understand what you're saying, because that's been my experience as well. That wherever people have hired people with disabilities, it has not necessarily been in the kinds of roles which are,
Yeah,
ones with great career ladders ahead of them. So
correct.
I totally understand that part. Um, I want to ask you one question, Richa, which I think is, I think we are entering slightly tricky territory here. But the truth is, a lot of organizations who choose to hire people with disabilities, I don't know if they really buy. I don't know if they understand the business case as much. I think very often it comes from uh, social justice plus, we want to be a progressive organization and be seen as someone who hires people of different
Yeah.
backgrounds. I wonder if you have any views on that.
So, Chalini, I think we are sitting at a space where different organizations have different motives to look at disability inclusion. And you're absolutely right. Very few organizations want to do it for the business case of inclusion. They are primarily looking at doing it because, one, it could be a wave because others are
Right.
doing it, or because it's a good to do, or because it looks good on the annual report.
PR,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, so those are the different motivations. But something that I learned when I was with Child Rights and You, that it doesn't matter why a person wants to donate, as long as there is donation coming in. So here also, I think it doesn't matter what the motive is, as long as there is a first step towards inclusion that is taking place, because there is just such a long way to go on this one. And I think somewhere I have that level of faith in persons with disabilities that if they are navigated the right way, they will figure out how they see growth and how they are able to convert the organization's thought process from just a good to do to actually looking at the business case of it.
By the way, I'm completely with you there. I think the motives, in the end, whatever they might be,
Yeah,
every motive is good so long as it moves people in the right direction, and so
correct.
long as people are able to back any motive with the right kind of, you know, resource providing, thoughtfulness, infrastructure. So I'm going to, with that, come to actually one of the big questions: that what do you think is what kind of management or leadership, is needed when you're hiring people who are with disabilities into your team? What makes a successful manager in your experience?
A huge amount of understanding and empathy, Shalini. I think you have to be a very empathetic leader to be able to take people along, to be able to understand them, and therefore to be able to offer them the right kind of accommodations as well as guidance. So, definitely, empathy and collaboration. Yeah.
Empathy and collaboration. Say more about the collaboration part. Empathy, I can understand.
So, I think what is important as a leader is to be able to inculcate the whole concept of why inclusion matters and therefore bring the teams together to be
Mm.
able to see that and drive that to the last mile. I think that is extremely important.
No, fantastic. In fact, more broadly, when we look at future of leadership and what's changing, one of the big ideas within inclusive leadership is just this: the ability to um, understand difference, diversity,
Yeah,
difference, and value it for what
yeah,
it is. And that obviously has elements of the sensitivity, empathy part that you spoke about already, uh, being able to see the value of those
yeah.
differences and
Correct.
having the skills to work with
Yes,
difference, because that's a skill. There are many, many, many leaders for whom working with people who are very different from them, and that difference can be across 100 different dimensions, but just working with people who are very different from them is challenging because they need to use a different language, they need to use a different lens at times, they need to
so
think
in
of
fact,
things they never thought of
yeah.
before.
So, in fact, if I was to compare myself, Shalini, from 6 years back to what I am today, I owe a lot of my leadership style to the people I work with. because I learn so much from them every day. Perhaps my empathy quotient is far higher today than what it used to be earlier. So clearly, even if perhaps an organization or a leadership is sitting at an intent level with a little bit of empathy, trust me, this is life changing, and this is truly something that can transform you as a leader.
And I totally believe that, actually. I totally believe that. I think, in fact, there's, some research that shows that even into leadership teams, you need to have every leader coming in with at least two dimensions of difference.
Yeah.
And it's that, those that's what really creates the diversity that leads to better decision making. Again, this is all stuff that's so much easier to speak of at a conceptual level. uh, you know, for many people that feels like, okay, that we're going to have to learn a lot to speak many different languages in a team meeting and wear different lenses. So you're absolutely right. I can absolutely see how it would be life changing. I can see how it would influence the culture of the organization, because you are demonstrating your organizational values in action on a daily basis to make this work. And of course, here I'm assuming that the organization which is hiring people with disabilities already has an intent for inclusion and an intent for, providing equal opportunities. So you are demonstrating that. In the process, those who work with them closely get transformed in the process. Those who don't work with them closely but understand what's happening in one part of their organization begin to realize just how limited some of our ideas are around the kind
Yes.
of person who can do a job. And I think a lot of it comes from there. Our ideas are often very narrow about, who's the right person for a particular job. So with that, we're almost at the end of our conversation. Before we sign off, Richa, any advice you would have for an organization, the 55% of organizations you spoke about who have an intent to start off on this journey and aren't quite sure where to, besides, of course, getting in touch with you?
I think the most important thing is that there is no reason why we should be scared. I understand that fear comes from a place of absolute, unawareness, perhaps, but take that baby step, and eventually everything falls in place. And the only other piece that I would like to highlight here is not everything has to be perfect. We
Hmm.
don't necessarily have to build the ramps to the perfection, have those workstations in the right dimensions. We don't have to have everything perfect before we think of embarking on this journey. We can always course correct this as we move along, and start our journey with perhaps those sets of people whom we think we are ready to include immediately, and then gradually move up the ladder. So I would say just take on and get started. Yeah,
Nice. So, baby steps, hire people with disabilities who you are ready for, take them in roles where they're likely to succeed, hire them into the teams with the evangelist to start off with, do a show and tell, in the process, build education and build a more inclusive work culture.
absolutely.
So, with that, thank you so much, Richa. So happy you could come on the show. And for all those who are watching, we have three more episodes in this limited series which are coming up. Next week, we have two. We have Sandeep Bidani and Madhwala. We're going to speak about what does it mean to work with or hire those who are visually impaired. And then we're going to take a look at hiring people for neurodivergence. And then our final episode, which will be a week after next, will be about what does it mean to experience disability at a personal and policy level. So please join us for the entire set. With that, thank you very much. Bye for
Thank
now.
you. Bye bye.